Imagine heading out alone for a quick day hike. No GPS, just a map, a few snacks, and a $2 poncho. That's exactly what 59-year-old Victoria Grover did in Utah's notorious Death Hollow, a place lined with steep canyons and rugged trails. But this wasn't Victoria's first rodeo. She had wilderness skills and decades of outdoor experience under her belt. But one wrong step changed everything, leaving her stranded, injured, and alone in the wilderness. She endured freezing nights, relentless dehydration, and something far worse. No one even knew she was missing. Victoria Grover was a 59-year-old physician's assistant and the only medical provider in her small town in Maine. She poured her heart and soul into caring for her community, leading her church, and being a dedicated wife and mother. Whenever she could, she'd get outside for a hike, and for her, the two most beautiful places were Maine and southern Utah. At 19 years old, Victoria went to Utah for another adventure, one that would change the course of her life and kind of give her direction on where she was going. She enrolled in a 6-week wilderness survival course, hoping to get closer to nature and find a bit of clarity on where she was going with her life, as her adult life was kind of just beginning. This part of southern Utah is famous for its slot canyons. It's a remote red rock desert carved by wind and water. Sand, sage, rock, and dirt dominate the landscape. The area gets hot in the summer, but the higher elevations also keep temperatures pretty moderate. And at night, in the winter, it usually drops below freezing. On the very first day of the course, Victoria was given a canteen, a map, and a compass, and told to hike 25 kilometers or 16 miles through landscape that just seemed like a totally foreign environment to her. She was pretty terrified to start off on this because it was a brand new adventure for her, but she was also determined. And that day taught her the basics of survival. Focus on the next step, find the right direction where you're going, and conserve your precious water. Hours later, completely exhausted and out of water, she stumbled into camp. Her reward? A mostly burnt, fire-roasted potato that she said was one of the best meals she ever had. And as the days went on, Victoria became stronger and smarter and more comfortable in the environment. She learned how to find water, what to eat, and how to navigate without a map. But the real test came when the students were dropped off on their own patch of desert for 5 days and told, find their way back. They were completely alone. Most people saw isolation and fear, but Victoria saw a bit of an opportunity. It was a chance to push herself even further. She thought 5 days alone in the wilderness was her ultimate test, but her biggest challenge was yet to come 40 years later. Box Death Hollow Wilderness is a wild and remote place in southern Utah. It's over 25,000 acres in some of the most rugged and isolated terrain you can imagine. The name Death Hollow comes from livestock that plunged their deaths trying to cross these steep, treacherous canyons. The landscape is a mix of these deep canyons, slick rock, patches of forest, which make it a maze even for the most experienced hikers. And the Forest Service doesn't mince words when they describe the area as an intimidating area to travel, and they warn that it's only suitable for seasoned backcountry adventurers. They stress the importance of extensive planning and research before attempting the backpacking route through Death Hollow. Victoria, with all her survival training from 40 years earlier, thought she was ready for this challenge, but in a place like this, even the best prepared can be caught off guard. After going to her son's wedding in Utah, Victoria's family returned to Maine, and she stayed back to reconnect with the Utah desert. She only had a week to explore and find some clarity and rediscover herself once again before returning to work. But this time, 40 years after her last adventure in Utah, she planned to take it pretty easy, to just do moderate day hikes and no extreme risks. Her backpack was pretty simple, no high-tech GPS gadgets, just a map, compass, some snacks, a canteen, and an unopened $2 poncho. Victoria got a hotel room for 5 days and planned to set off for her first hike in Box Death Hollow Wilderness on Monday. Before she left, she told the clerk at the hotel that she wouldn't be back until that evening and asked him to hold her dinner for her. She asked him for directions to the trailhead, but didn't tell anyone else where she was going. The drive to the trailhead of Hell's Backbone. Okay, the trail names are really starting to get to me. In most of the stories I cover, there seems to be these really ominous trail names or names of areas. Death Hollow, Hell's Backbone. You'd think that they could pick less terrifying names like Puppy Snuggles Trail or Unicorn Valley. But no, we got to go with Hell's Backbone. Oh, but also, if you're into stories where survival means more than just dodging a rogue bunny, be sure to like this video and subscribe, because who knows, the next story might have us rafting down Crocodile Skull Rapids or ziplining over Jagged Cliff Canyon. Anyways, back to the story. So that drive to Hell's Backbone, it wasn't far, but it was pretty remote and it wasn't well marked and kind of off the beaten path. Victoria got there really early, the sun was just beginning to rise, and she hit the trail excited to be back in familiar territory. The plan was simple that day, just hike a 6-mile round trip to Salt Creek, enjoy the view, and be back with plenty of time to soak in the bathtub at the hotel. It was going to be a warm day at 7:30 a.m. It was already about 18 degrees Celsius or 65 Fahrenheit, and it would get much hotter by noon. As she set off, Victoria said, "I was just really happy. It had been so many years since I'd been there and so many years since I'd been able to do anything like that, so I felt like I was really flying down the trail." She made good time covering the first couple of miles without any issue. When she reached Salt Creek, the view was breathtaking, and she was just in awe of how the open red rock valley stretched out in front of her. And this is exactly what she came for, and she was starting to get that clarity and connection to the land that she really wanted. She dipped her feet into the cool water of the creek and realized that she was pretty early, that she had quite a few hours left in the day, and that she was feeling the need to maybe explore a little bit more. She decided that another couple miles wouldn't hurt. She was no longer on the official path, but followed this faint trail that led deeper into the wilderness. At this point, Victoria hadn't seen anybody else, and she felt like she was pretty alone out there in the wilderness. But she was enjoying it, and, she felt comfortable out there, and she was getting what she really wanted from that trip. She kind of reflected on her life and her son's wedding, her medical practice, and just how happy she was in life. By late afternoon, it was time to turn back. The sun was starting to set, and she'd already gone a lot further than she had planned. But on the way down, things took a turn. The landscape became this maze of rocks, canyons, and ledges, and Victoria suddenly found herself stuck. Each path she tried seemed to lead her further off course. The sun dipped lower and lower, and her surroundings started to become really unfamiliar. But she didn't panic because she had years of experience, and she told herself just to stop, calm down, sit down, and figure it out. She stopped and said, "Use your head, not your legs," which was an old Girl Scout rule that she lived by. She thought about spending the night out in the open there, but felt embarrassed at the idea of being rescued because the hotel would probably have people come looking for her that night when she didn't return for dinner. And oddly enough, she'd been in a pretty similar situation before as a 20-year-old Girl Scout leader. She was on a 2-week canoe trip and made the group stay on shore for an extra day and a half because there was really high winds and waves in the water. The other guides and all the girls wanted to face the wind and waves, but Victoria made the really tough call to stay put. They arrived a day late to waiting parents, but when the parents found out why the group was late, they were happy that she took a responsible and safe approach. And if you've seen my latest video on the Lake Temiskaming canoe tragedy, where the risky decisions led to disaster, you'll know just how valuable a conservative approach is. Victoria pulled out a small flashlight that she carried in her emergency kit, and it led the way for her. But as it got darker, that little flashlight was just pathetic. It didn't give her much light at all. As the night closed in, she was getting more and more anxious, but kept moving, determined not to have to be rescued. And then suddenly, without warning, she slipped, sliding dangerously close to a 9-meter or 30-foot cliff. Heart pounding, Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. And that was the moment where she realized that she had to wait for daylight. So she gathered some firewood, lit a fire, and prepared to spend a night out in the open. In the back of her mind, she believed searchers would probably come tomorrow, and she'd likely run into them as she hiked back to the stream, and that would be a little bit embarrassing, but at least she was going to be getting back. As she sat in the cold that night, wrapped in her cheap poncho, sitting in the sand, she had no idea how long her wait was going to be, and how much worse things were going to get. Victoria's first night in the wilderness was surprisingly peaceful. She enjoyed the fire, watched the stars, and listened to coyotes yip in the distance. It was actually overall a pretty nice night. The fire kept her warm in the chilly desert, and though sleep didn't really come easily, she was relatively comfortable. Morning came with a sense of urgency. Victoria knew that she had to head back down into the valley and rejoin the trail as soon as possible. Her breakfast that morning consisted of just a few pieces of trail mix and a banana. She studied her map, looking at the most gentle way down, hoping to avoid those steep ledges that she had seen the night before. But this was Box Death Hollow, and the terrain was not forgiving. Each path she attempted seemed to be a dead end at a sheer drop off a cliff. Hours passed and the sun was now high in the sky, and Victoria grew increasingly concerned. She was already 11 hours late and was for sure convinced that searchers were out looking for her. She just had to get back to the trail quickly, apologize for being late, and run away from embarrassment. By now, Victoria had run out of water and was starting to feel the effects of dehydration. Her muscles were aching, her tongue was dry, and she was starting to get a headache. And that's when she saw the creek only 300 feet away. So she was eager to get there so she could refill her water container. Next came the moment that changed everything. Victoria found herself facing this short 4-foot drop, one she thought she could manage pretty easily. She carefully turned around, slid down the rock slowly, but as gravity took over, she lost control. Her feet hit the ground, and that's when she heard the horrific crack and felt the searing pain of her leg being broken. She said, "I fell sideways, and my left leg hit a rock that was just at the right angle to shatter the bones in my lower leg." Victoria's medical training instantly kicked in, and she was able to assess the damage and ignore the panic that was growing inside of her. The stream was just 91 meters or 300 feet away, but it might as well have been 100 miles away. Dehydration was setting in even more, and she needed to get to that water soon, but she knew moving towards the stream and crawling on her leg risked turning her injury into a compound fracture. And with that came the very real danger of bleeding to death. She was sure that the searchers were probably only a few hundred yards away anyways, so she stayed put. Desperately, she started banging rocks and yelling, using the Girl Scout signal for help, 3 calls at a time. She shouted and banged rocks for the next 10 hours, but no one answered. With daylight fading, Victoria knew she had no choice. She had to get to water. Without it, she'd just grow too weak to do anything. She definitely couldn't walk. Heck, she couldn't even stand. So she made a splint for her leg and then began the agonizing crawl towards the stream. Each movement sent pain shooting through her broken leg. But when she finally got there, she plunged her face into the cool stream, which was such a relief, and then filled her water bottle. And before she knew it, another night was coming, and in a few hours the temperature was going to drop. And she was also close to that water now, which is where it's going to be cooler. So to get into a warmer spot, this meant dragging her broken body away from the creek where it was a little bit warmer. That night, Victoria faced a new enemy, and that was the cold. So, of course, her concern was making a fire. She used an old Native American trick, creating an ash bed from the remains of her fire, burying the hot coals in the sand to keep her lower body warm. But that night's sleep was impossible. And she was also wondering why rescuers hadn't found her yet. Exhaustion, pain, and the reality of her situation weighed on her mind. She started to hear voices too. Her son, park rangers, and rescuers, and looked around looking for people, happy to finally see somebody, but no one was there. Victoria drank a water bottle every 2 or 3 hours to make sure she was hydrated, but that created another problem, relieving herself. She couldn't just get up and walk into the bushes. So 5 feet from her little camp, she dug another trench, which she called her cat litter box, and she would use that regularly throughout the night. Later, as she was trying to sleep, a chilling thought crept into her mind. She hadn't told a single person exactly where she was going. The hotel clerk knew the trailhead that she was aiming for, but no one knew exactly where she was going to be, and this was when she first realized that maybe no one was even looking. Wednesday morning came, and Victoria's first thought was the voices. She wanted them to be real. She squinted into the daylight looking for people and rescuers or for helicopters in the air, but there was nothing around. Those hallucinations were just her mind playing tricks on her, fed by exhaustion and pain. She took some Tylenol for the pain, but it barely dulled the agony that was in her leg. But once again, the sun came up and thankfully erased the cold and the hallucinations in minutes. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, she drifted into a real sleep. And then she was woken up by some dark shapes circling above her. Any guesses on what they were? Comment below, and I'll give you a few minutes, or a few seconds. First, she thought it was kind of interesting because these things were just soaring above her. And what were they? Well, they were vultures. She was enjoying watching them for a bit because it was something to break the monotony and take her mind off of her pain. But as more and more vultures came and circled over her, she couldn't help but feel that they were really checking her out and maybe looking for their next meal. When one vulture flew a little too close to her and hovered a little too long, she had enough and just yelled, "I'm not dead yet," by flailing her arms at them. And then the vultures backed off, leaving her for now, but hoping for a good, tasty main meal. Victoria's meager firewood supply had run out by nightfall, and this would be her first night without fire. She couldn't go gather wood in her state, so she wrapped herself tightly in that flimsy little poncho and put it over her head and was breathing into it to capture warmth. But of course the condensation built up in there, and she had to take it off, throw it out, shake it off, and then repeat the process again, and it only helped a little bit. Her body was shivering uncontrollably at times, just making sleep impossible. Every night she thought about the rescue, and tonight she was sure that the hotel would have alerted authorities by now, and they must be out looking for her. She napped when she could and continued yelling and banging on rocks whenever she was awake. And then it started to rain, but Victoria was actually pretty happy about this. It meant that she didn't have to make that horrible crawl back to the creek. And with the rain, hunger, pain, most people would be pretty miserable, but that night, Victoria kind of found a silver lining. She said the smell of the fresh flowers rose from the desert floor, and for 2 hours, the smell was just incredible. And she took that smell as a sign that it would be a good day and that she'd be rescued. Thursday came, and then Victoria spent her 4th night shivering uncontrollably, curled up in the same spot she'd been in for days. Her body was really weakening now. She now had this painful bed sore, and it was a distraction that she couldn't do anything about. The cold was absolute torture, and she began to really question why no one had come for her. Was it incompetence? Was she too far off the expected search area? And why, after 3 brutal nights, was she still holding on? She believed it was her mental training and the lessons that had been ingrained in her from years of wilderness survival experiences. Throughout her life, she had actually often asked herself, what would I do if it ever came to this? And now, facing death, the answer was clear, that she would fight and survive. On Friday, the warm sun offered a bit of comfort in the morning, but she was just drifting in and out of sleep. And by evening, her situation got really, really bad. The last of her snacks were gone, her water was nearly empty again, and her flimsy poncho was now full of holes and totally useless. And at midnight, her shivering just stopped, which was a bad, bad sign. She knew hypothermia was setting in and really started to wonder how long she'd be able to endure this. Victoria also had type 2 diabetes, and since she didn't take any really substantial food with her, she was now at a point where her kidneys were starting to fail. For the first time, Victoria faced the reality that she just might die, right there alone in the red rocks of the Utah desert. And for the first time, she cried. But then she quickly snapped out of the despair. Her will to survive was strong, and she wasn't done yet, she told herself. And then she started doing what she could to stay warm. She did small calisthenics, lifting her arms up and down and stretching every few minutes. And then that night, she just got angry. More angry than she'd been the entire time she'd been out there. She was just so tired of shivering violently all night. She said shivering like that is like jumping into an icy lake and never being allowed to get out. It's exhausting. In her mind, she clung to hope, but physically she was hanging on by a thread. Saturday morning came and Victoria had all but resigned herself to the idea that this may be her last day. The cold, hunger, and pain were relentless, and she could feel her body shutting down. But then, in the quiet valley, she finally heard something. At first, she wondered if it was just another hallucination in her mind playing cruel, horrible tricks on her again. But this time it was real. It was the unmistakable roar of helicopter blades cutting through the air. And that's when the Utah Department of Public Safety helicopter pilots spotted something. First, they couldn't believe their eyes. There lying by the stream was Victoria, waving frantically. They had expected this mission to be a body recovery, so they landed nearby and made their way down to her, and for a brief moment, Victoria panicked, thinking, what would they say? She felt like she was a child about to get scolded out at the principal's office for causing trouble. But when the two rescuers got to her, there was no lecture. They simply asked, how can we help? One of the paramedics wrapped his jacket around her, offering warmth that she hadn't felt in days. The other put his coat over her as well. And there were no harsh words, just kindness and care, which is exactly what she needed.
Us doing our little job is no different than anybody else would have done, any other crew in the country. But when it all works out and they're alive, it feels pretty amazing.
Within 20 minutes, she was being airlifted to the hospital and still in shock, but alive. Victoria thanked them profusely for searching so long and apologized for the trouble of a multi-day search, but to her surprise, the pilot just told her they only just started looking.
Physician's assistant from Maine defying the odds as she manages to survive almost 4 days in the remote hiking area of Utah. John Daly explains how she is, crediting her medical background and her faith for saving her life.
In the days following her rescue, Victoria didn't want to talk to reporters, but with the media calling nonstop, she reluctantly agreed to an interview.
I really wasn't scared until I stopped shivering. That was the point when I got scared, because that was the point when I thought, if somebody doesn't find me pretty soon, I'm going to die of hypothermia.
There was one question that she hoped wouldn't come up, and that was the question of why no one knew where she was. But of course it did come up, and she kind of just kept quiet about it and about the young clerk at the hotel and took full responsibility for it herself. It wasn't until several days later, after speaking with the hotel owner, that Victoria pieced it all together. The young hotel clerk had gone on vacation without informing anyone of her plans. It was just a small, thoughtless mistake that had almost cost her life. Over time, Victoria was able to process the trauma and reflect on her experience. For a long time, she carried guilt, worrying that she had put others in danger by requiring such a large rescue effort. But after years of healing, she realized that this wasn't true. No one was endangered, and she hadn't done anything wrong. She even forgave the young man at the lodge, hoping that he too had let go of any guilt that he might have felt. Victoria continued to run her busy medical practice and spend a lot of time outdoors. She never gave up on the wilderness, and her love for the outdoors remained as strong as ever. Reflecting on her experience, she says, "The wilderness is safe. It was safe then, and it's still safe now. It's civilization that's so anxiety-provoking." She's got a point there. So let me know what you think about Victoria's story. If you were in her shoes, what would you have done differently? Is there one item that you would have brought that she didn't have? For me, I like taking a spot device everywhere with me when I go out into the Yukon wilderness. It's a must-have item. It allows you to be tracked in real time, and I can send help for an emergency if something goes wrong. And it could have helped Victoria get rescued a lot earlier. But we're really happy that Victoria made it out okay. She recovered from her injuries, and she also deserves a boatload of credit for keeping herself calm and alive during that horrifying ordeal. It's pretty amazing to keep calm under those conditions, considering the pain that she was in and the fear that she would have felt. Anyways, thanks for watching.